Hello, I'm Stan, the History Man, Dr. Sandler. I want to talk today about the Confederacy. Of course, a lot has been in the news a lot lately, last couple of years, because of the desire to get rid of a lot of these Confederate monuments. But I want to talk about something that a lot of people don't know about the Confederacy, which, of course, is the name for those seceded states at the beginning of the Civil War. And that is that the Confederacy was a one-party state. And the Democrat Party controlled. Now, the Democrat Party then was like the Democratic Party today, to be fair. But actually, Jefferson Davis never ran for reelection. Who's to oppose him? And you say, how did he get elected in the first place? Well, a group, you could call it a clique, if you will, of the planter aristocracy pretty well said he's going to be our man. So he never had to face, unlike Lincoln, of course, who faced a real campaign in 1864, which he thought he'd lose. But the Confederacy was strictly done. In fact, the Republican Party or the Lincoln Party did not receive a single popular vote in the Deep South. It was that unpopular. So you can see there were not political rallies or campaigns or anything, get rid of Jefferson Davis or the Democrats. Now, Davis did face a lot of opposition. After all, these were the Confederate states, and each of these states had more power than the Union states. And a lot of the governors, not a lot, but a number of them, didn't like Davis at all. A lot of political, personal controversy. The governor of North Carolina, Zebulon B. Vance, detested Davis. And when Lee's army was just a bunch of scarecrows, they were just out of clothing and all, the warehouses of North Carolina were packed with brand new, fresh cotton uniforms that Zebulon B. Vance was not about to release to the Confederacy. So, of course, it's the decision of the Confederacy to pull out was one of the dumbest decisions ever made. That's right up there with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or the Nazi attack on Russia. When you realize the disparity in the quantity, I mean, the Civil War was really a railroad war, and it needs a lot of iron and so on. There was one iron manufacturer in the whole Confederacy, and that there are a number of northern iron manufactories, as they call them, that are factories, which outproduced that one. So in other words, a number of single factories that could outproduce the whole South for iron ore. One of the major or iron devices, things, whatever, locomotives, railroad rails. They were so hard up for rail in the Confederacy, they actually laid down wooden rails with an iron strap screwed in over the top. Sometimes that strap got loose and had disastrous consequences when it was picked up by a passenger train. There was one telegraph spinning company in the Confederacy, and there were 5 or 6, almost 10 maybe, I'm not sure the exact number, in the North. And of course, the telegraphy, you had to get the messages out, do this, don't do that, whatever. And the Confederacy couldn't do that. And the South, the main thing of the South in the last 25, 30 years of the Union before the Civil War was opposition to the intercontinental, transcontinental railroad, opposition to free land, opposition to the excuse me, tariffs and so on. When they left the Union, that was it. No more opposition. Please excuse me. So they lost there. And but here's how they said they could make up for it. And this is serious. One Yankee or one Confederate can whip 10 Yankees because they lived by stereotypes, at least their spokesman. And the Northerners are all kind of like stunted wage slaves. They worked in these dark satanic mills, whereas the Confederates, they were out in the open and fresh air. And I'm saying, what is so stunted about a Minnesota lumberjack or a Pennsylvania coal miner or an Iowa corn farmer? These people are out in the out, probably doing more work on the outside than these sprigs of the aristocracy racing their horses around, looking at the slaves doing all the scut work. But that's what they believed. The Southerners, they're used to the outdoor life, and the Northerners were not. And of course, in the North, almost as much as in the South, the primary occupation was farming, and that'll toughen you up as much as anything, farming. Most of the Union soldiers were farm boys, okay? But the Confederacy, their writers didn't bother to look into that. They lived in a world of fantasy. The greatest fantasy of the Confederacy was an empire, whereas Jefferson spoke of an empire of freedom, they spoke of an empire of slavery. Slavery is a good thing, and therefore it should be expanded. Well, expanded where? The Republicans say you can't expand in the United States anymore. In the Caribbean, all those islands, and they sent expeditions, not government expeditions, but private expeditions, to try to take over some of these Caribbean islands and turn them into slave states, which then could be run by the South. In other words, slavery is such a good thing that we should expand. Of course, that's the whole thing about slavery. It's very expansive. One reason being, well, the whole Confederacy, tobacco and cotton, it wears the soil. That's why there's constant pressure movement into the deep South and West, to Alabama, Texas, and so on, Louisiana, as time went on. So it really was very much an extractive economic or agricultural situation. However, that being said, I should point out that the highest value export of the United States in 1860, that is even the Civil War, was cotton. Okay, slave-grown cotton. So normally they said, slavery, cotton is king, and the slave then, I hate to even say it, the slave would fetch $2,000, and in $1860. So this, you can see why their economic ideas weren't totally insane, but that's not the same as fighting a war. And of course, they shot themselves in the foot again because the European countries, especially England, got tired of all the trouble with the southern states and the Civil War and so on. So they started to look elsewhere for their cotton, and they looked to Egypt and India. So the South, when they got back into the Union, there was not the same demand for cotton as there had been. So it was a disastrous situation, but they kept order in the South by what I call a social totalitarianism. You could say, Jeff Davis is wrong. I don't like him for this or that or the other thing, and he wouldn't be shot or sent to a labor camp. But you might be beaten up. Violence in the South was much more than in the North. Just everyday violence, fights, knife fights, gun fights, whatever. And you can see that in a sense in the Civil War. The massacres of the war, like the Fort Pillow massacre, were all done by Southern soldiers. And I can't think of any Northern massacre. And they lived by their feelings, and then they had these fantasies of slaveocracies and how they were personally so much superior to the Yankees. And of course, I have to admit, it took the Yankees long enough to beat them. And most historians would agree that's because of the generals that the South had the better generals. And that's Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee. There's a lot of scholarship laid aside. Well, Lee wasn't that good, but I think they mainly say because he was a racist. Well, of course they were. If they were Southern generals, they undoubtedly were racist, except maybe Jackson. Jackson did push to have blacks sit in the church to which he attended. I think it was the balcony, but still he did push for that, making a non-racist, but still. But Lee was very definitely Lee's greatest contribution, I think, almost as much as his wartime contribution to the South, was after the war. A lot of the Southern hotheads, like they never learned, we're going to go in the woods and we're going to fight a guerrilla warfare. And he said, no, don't do it. We've had enough war. And so that he pretty well ended. He only lived 5 years after the war, but he ended his years in good odor, shall we say. Well, those are my thoughts on the Confederacy, and I appreciate your comments on them. This is Stan the History Man, thanking you for listening. Looking forward to hearing you again or talking to you again. Bye-bye.